about why Argentina? Of all the places in the world that I could work, that we could send missionaries, why send them to Argentina? Perfect. How I got there and why I stayed. So a little bit of my story, I guess. Last night I was sharing with the junior youth, and I was telling them about how I was kind of like a reluctant missionary, I would say. So somebody that did not expect to be a missionary, did not want to be a missionary. Certainly I never imagined myself living outside of Canada. And so I'm from Edmonton originally, so I was in Edmonton, going to university, serving at my local church, working on campus with a Christian group, kind of really involved in different things, and serving God and loving serving God where I was at. And all of that changed one Sunday when I was just in a regular service at my church, and I got what we call a word from the Lord. I had an audible voice that said to me, "Laura, you have to go on a missions trip." And I was very surprised and not very happy, because it was not what I had imagined for my life. So after that, I went to talk to one of my pastors, and I said, I think God wants me to go on a missions trip. And he kind of said, "Oh, yeah, that sounds good." Like, no, I think like God spoke to me with an audible voice and told me to go on a missions trip. And he kind of said, "Oh, yeah, that's okay." Like, yeah. Who doesn't get an audible voice from the Lord? I don't know. So he was not fazed by this. And so he said, "Well, you already took French in school. I took French immersion my whole life. You also took Spanish classes in high school and at university. So why don't you go to Latin America? If you're going to go for a short-term trip, a couple of months somewhere, go somewhere where you already speak the language." So that's how I ended up going to Latin America. And through this pastor, I was able to make contact with some people that were working in Argentina. So next slide, please. That's South America, and that's Argentina there in the south. If you're not sure, if you didn't know which country was Argentina, that is Argentina. So I think that I could have really ended up going to any Latin American Spanish-speaking country, but of course the Lord knew why I would end up in Argentina. Specifically, it's because I know now that I really resonate with the culture. I love living in Argentina, and the way of living that they have there fits really well with how I like. So the Lord really knew. So I went first for 2 months, and when I was there, the missionaries that I worked with invited me to come back and work for a year, so I did that. And then I came back to Canada because the year was up, and I came back and didn't have any plans. I had graduated from university, but didn't have a steady job and wasn't really sure what to do with my life. And I wanted to return to Argentina, but I didn't want to go just because I wanted to go. I wanted to go if the Lord wanted me to go. So I was kind of saying, "Okay, God, feel free to talk to me again. It would be nice to get a second audible voice. That would be very convenient, very helpful, easy to obey." And so I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I never heard anything from the Lord. And I have yet to hear a second audible voice from the Lord in my life. So I'm waiting for what we kind of call this mystical missionary call. Have you heard of that? The missionary call? And I thought, well, I don't want to go if I don't have the call. See, I want to obey. This is my thinking. So I said, well, since I'm waiting around to see if I'm going to get this mystical missionary call, maybe I should go to seminary and get some theological training. This is my thinking. I said, well, I can go to seminary and start getting some training, and then if I get the missionary call, I will be sort of on my way to being prepared, and I won't have to wait so long in order to leave. And if I never get the missionary call, well, it won't be that bad to have learned theology anyway, so I might as well go do some theology. So I went to seminary in Edmonton and just kind of get prepared just in case I were to get this mystical missionary call that we always talk about. At the same time, I kept attending things like missions conferences, and this was back in about the year 2005 and 6. And at that time was kind of the big boom when everybody was talking about the 10-40 window. Who has heard of the 10-40 window? Raise your hand. Who thinks they could define for me what the 10-40 window is? Oh, interesting. People have heard of it but can't define it. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. That's a world map. If you didn't know that, please take geography. And so the 10-40 window is an imaginary window or a box. The bottom line of that box is 10 degrees north of the equator, and the top line of the box is 40 degrees north of the equator, which is why it's called the 10-40 window. It goes from the 10th parallel to the 40th parallel, north of the equator, from the western side of Africa to the eastern side of Asia. And that is basically the block of countries where there is the least Christian presence. is that part of the world, roughly. I mean, we have north of there, we have Mongolia would also be considered part of that, Indonesia to the south. But in general, those are the countries where we have the least Christian presence and the most number of unreached people's groups, people who have no access to the gospel, little or no access to the gospel. And so everyone was saying we have to go to the 1040 window. We have to go to unreached people's groups. We have to go especially to Muslim communities. And I'm thinking, and I'm sitting in these conferences and I'm thinking, yes, I agree. We have to reach those people with the gospel. The problem is that I don't have any desire to go to any of those countries. I don't ever want to really go to either Asia or Africa. And I don't have a heart to do pioneer evangelistic work. I want to teach and disciple Christians so that they can grow. Does that make sense? And so I'm hearing that this is the need that we have. I don't really have the desire to fulfill that need, and I also don't think that I have the giftings to do that. So if I want to do missions, but I don't want to do that, well, then maybe I'm just a bad Christian. Maybe I'm a bad person. Maybe I should be obeying God better. This was my internal struggle. Does that make sense, what I'm sharing? Okay, so I finished up my first year of seminary, and at that point, I had to go see my faculty advisor to get him to approve my course selections for the following year. So when I go see him, this is a man who spent 30 years of his life in Indonesia, just south of the 1040 window, working with Muslim groups in a totally unreached people group. So that his passion is exactly what everyone was talking about at these missions conferences. So I went to see this professor, and I gave him my paper, and he said, oh yeah, your courses, look great, but I have a question for you. Why are you in this program? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And so as Laura often does, I just burst into tears. I just start crying. I cry every day. This is what I do. And so I'm sitting there with this, fairly intimidated by this really intelligent professor, former missionary in front of me, and I just start crying. And he was very, very gracious. And he just took the Kleenex box and pushed it towards me and just sat there and waited for me to kind of, compose myself. And then I thought, well, I don't want to tell him what I'm thinking, because I know what he's going to tell me. He's going to say, Laura, this is the need, the 1040 window. You have to go. God is obviously calling you there, so you should go. So I said, I don't want to hear that, so I don't want to tell him anything. But I'm already sitting in his office crying, so I have to kind of explain myself somewhat, I guess. And so I said, well, I'm already here. I might as well just confess. So I basically just blurted out all that I had been thinking and feeling, and he knew that I'd been in Argentina, and I told him about my passions and what I wanted to do, and that I was conflicted because I was hearing all this thing, and so I must be a terrible Christian for not wanting to go to the 1040 window. And so he listened to me very patiently, and then he says, well, Laura, a few things. First of all, my passion is this part of the world and working with unreached people's groups. But in Indonesia, I wouldn't want you on my team, because you are a great person up front. You're a great leader, and you're a woman, and I don't want somebody that outgoing on my team. We want people that don't attract attention, and you attract attention. He was being very diplomatic. I'm sure I'm not remembering his wording very, very well. And so you fit really well with your personality into Latin America. And he said, so actually what you're thinking and what's happening in the world are not conflicting. And he gave me a book. He said, here, take this book. Next slide, please, Peter. It's a book called The Next Christendom by Philip Jenkins. And it's talking about the shift in global Christianity. So I took this book home and I read it. And this book talks about how Christianity in the Western Hemisphere is essentially dying. Okay? Christianity in Europe and in North America, every year, as we know, there are fewer Christians, and there are fewer churches, and there are fewer resources. And so if up until now, how have we been doing missions? People have been going from England, for example, or from North America to all these least reached parts of the world. But that model is not going to be feasible in the next century. The next picture, please. I don't know if you can see that, but regional distribution of Christians. On the left, we have 1910. 66% of Christians were in Europe, in the world, and 27% were in the Americas. The Americas being, of course, both North and South America, all of the Americas. And there's almost negligible number of Christians in the Middle East, in Asia Pacific, and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Fast forward 100 years, in the year 2010, the percentage of Christians in Europe has gone down from 66% to only 25%. The number of Christians in the Americas, the percentage has gone up. So from 27% to 36%. But we all know that in the last 100 years, the number of Christians in Canada has not gone up, nor in the United States. That is because the number of Christians in Latin America has gone up. That is why the Americas have grown. The number of Christians in sub-Saharan Africa used to be negligible. 1.4% of the global Christian population was sub-Saharan Africa, and now it's 26.3%, 23.6, sorry, as of 2010. And Asia Pacific also has grown, although if you think of this, the sheer number of people in Asia Pacific, let's say in China and India, if they only account for 13% of global Christianity, it's because there still are so few Christians in those countries. See, they should be holding a lot greater percentage than they are. And so Christianity in North America and in Europe is dying, but Christianity in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa is just booming. And they are becoming major Christian centers. But what happens is that in a lot of those places, and Argentina is one of them, the church can be called a mile wide and an inch deep. So people are coming to faith, but they're not being discipled. And so they need discipleship and teaching in order to strengthen the church so that these countries can become a strong missionary sending force. So if we, as a global church, as Christians all over the world, 2019, are thinking about how are we going to reach all these unreached peoples groups, we need to be looking to our brothers and sisters in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa for them to be sending out missionaries to those parts of the world. Does that make sense? And so by reading this book and hearing this theory, which I've read multiple times since then, I was able to reconcile my giftings and my interest to do teaching and discipleship in Latin America with the need that I saw to reach these unreached peoples groups. And so that's when I decided to call up the BGC and sign up for missions work in Argentina, basically for the rest of my life. And so I stayed in Latin America because Latin America is becoming a strong missionary sending force. Next slide. Here's a missions conference that I attended in Argentina in 2015. There were 2,000 people in attendance from over about 15 countries. And it was all about Latin American missionaries being sent out. So I heard testimonies of Brazilian missionaries working in the Middle East, for example, Argentine missionaries working among tribal groups in Northern Africa. And so all about how Latin American countries are becoming this descending force to be able to go to these places. So that's like a big scale conference that I attended. And then also I've had experience on a smaller scale with sending Latin American missionaries. Next slide. This is my church in Tucumán where I attend in Argentina. This is church service last Sunday, so 6 days ago. Well, I was in Murillo, had Murillo Baptist, Community Baptist. They had a guest speaker. She's standing up there in the green, and you can't really see her, but the next slide hopefully shows her a little bit better. Yeah. Her name is Roberta, and she is Argentine, and she has been working in Mozambique for the last 4 years as a missionary. And she is on her furlough to Argentina, while I'm on my furlough to Canada. So I don't get to meet her, which is a whole disappointing thing, but I can go cry about it later. And so my church in Tucumán is participating in sending out a missionary from Argentina to Mozambique to do ministry there. And at the same time, they are also receiving me as a missionary to help train them and teach them and help them to send her out better. The next slide. Here she is with some of the people in our congregation. And so it's so exciting to see that the Argentine church is learning that who they are and saying we are not only a country or a church that receives missionaries, we also are a church that sends out missionaries. And so I want to thank you for supporting me as I support them as they go and reach the ends of the earth. And so that is why I went to Argentina and how I got there and why I stayed there. Any questions, concerns, comments, complaints? That's what I always say to my students. Questions, concerns, comments, and complaints. Everything is welcome. Yes, Charlie. Mm-hmm. No, the countries that have the least Christian presence. there is certainly, Christianity is growing there for sure. You might have more information than I do in terms of statistics. But I think that for China, for example, yes, there's a Christian movement, absolutely. But still, the sheer number of people in China, the percentage of Christians is still quite low, because the bulk of the world population is also in that area. Have you heard other statistics, or?
No, I haven't. I just wondered, because there are so many stories
Mm-hmm.
out.
Absolutely. In fact, like the BGC at a national scale, they are working in Armenia with a project to help train Iranian Christians. So it's very difficult for Canadians to visit Iran, especially as missionaries, but they can go to Armenia, which is a neighboring country. So then they've just came back like 2 weeks ago. So BGC's national director, Kevin Schuler, out of Edmonton, and others went with people that are working with BGC among Muslims in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver area, went to Armenia. Iranian Christians left Iran and went into Armenia to get trained by them, and then can go back to their home communities, because it's safer to do that in Armenia, somewhere in the mountains, than it would be to do it in Iran. So there is movement. There is movement, absolutely. But I think that that is still the bloc that has the least Christian presence in the world, I believe. Any other questions? Comments? Concerns? Complaints? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so tomorrow I'm going to be sharing a lot about that. So I work at the local church. I also teach at a Bible institute to try to train up leaders in the local church. And I'm also staff with the campus ministry, so trying to train up kind of the higher educated Christians, at least in my area of the country. So a lot of teaching. So I'm always involved in teaching and discipleship, but in these 3 different areas. So are you going to be here tomorrow? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, then we can talk about it later, maybe. Yeah.
Will be live streamed and being recorded.
Oh, well, I should come first. Nice. Good to know. And then also, so if you're not aware of what I do and you want to receive my letters, I send out a quarterly update every 3 months. You can sign up for it at the back of the table. You can get it either by email or by regular postal mail if you want that. And also, I have a new prayer card, so if you'd like to take one, they're at the table at the back as well. Thank you for your question. That's a great question. Anything else? Yes, Larry.
Could you, on the mic, repeat what this lady was saying, because we couldn't hear it here.
Great. She was saying, so first she asked what I was doing, and then she said that tomorrow, what I'm going to be sharing here tomorrow morning will be live streamed on YouTube, apparently. So if you want, you can not come to church and you can live stream it from home. No, I mean, no, that's a complaint from over here, no. Yeah, so I guess if someone is not going to be here tomorrow, they can get that later. I didn't know this. That's why I was just being informed that I'm going to be recorded, which is fine. Anything else? Yeah, Greg. Great. Well, you should come tomorrow morning to Sunday school. But yeah, so Argentina is an interesting mix because about 90% of the people are of Spanish or Italian descent. So it's very different than, say, Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, the Caribbean. Also, for example, there was almost negligible the number of African slaves that were brought over, if perhaps even none. So then the ethnic makeup, for example, is very, very different. I actually don't stand out as particular. I mean, you can see the range of skin tones there. They're all Argentine. So that kid and I could be his mom, practically. That kind of a thing. A lot of Italian influence in terms of the culture, in terms of the food, in terms of the mannerisms. Speak with my hands all the time, very animated. Quite different than, let's say, Bolivia, a neighboring country, but a much more reserved. People are physically, they're much shorter, much stouter, much darker, and then much more reserved in terms of their mannerisms, in terms of communication, that kind of thing. Yeah. Will you here tomorrow morning?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. Anything else?
You live in a house with other people, or?
I live in an apartment. apartment. I rent an apartment, but open door policy. I live alone, but that's kind of, I live right downtown, and the city I live in is Tucumán. It's 1 million people, and the bus system is such that you kind of have to take, from the outlying neighborhoods, take one bus downtown and then switch buses to a different place. So I work with students, for example, and a lot of them have to take 2 buses to get from their house to their university, because there's not one central campus. Like, you know, the Faculty of Law will be over here, Faculty of Arts will be over here, Education over here, that kind of a thing. But then everybody can get to my apartment from their house or from their university in only one bus. So my apartment is kind of like central, and then I have a spare bed that gets used by girls all the time. So in fact, like while I'm here, actually girls living in my apartment, and they're having meetings. They had a meeting yesterday in my apartment, I think, probably. I saw photos, so I think that's probably what happened. And so I don't live alone, but I do live a lot in community. So during the week, I probably share about 7 or 8 meals with other people. So lunch and supper, a couple different days. Certainly, so very Latin American. It's not potluck. I sometimes do the cooking, but I often actually order in food because I can order in this. So people are like, "Oh, it's I can order in homemade, freshly made, healthy meals for about $4 Canadian." So why would I ever cook? I guess is kind of the question. Yeah. So yes, they do just drop in. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes, yeah. So I think that other parts of the world do have that drop-in culture more than Argentina does, but certainly people will say, "Hey, Laura," like they'll message me, I'm around the corner. Are you free?" It's like, "Yeah, come on in. I'm preparing my lesson for class tonight. You can prepare it with me." It's kind of a thing. So trying to never be really under the wire to finish a project because I might get a drop-in the last hour. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
The economic crisis that just happened in September, has that impacted you at all?
Wow, great question. So if you're unaware, Argentina has been in economic crisis for several years. Currently a 30 to 40% inflation rate in Argentina. So it has not affected me because I have a foreign income. So as an example, I rent an apartment, and apartment contracts are always 2 years long in Argentina, and my apartment contract has built in every 6 months a 12.5% increase. So it's just built into the contract, which is 25% annually, which is actually less than what the actual inflation is. So it's worse for my landlady than it is for me, I guess you could say. But I have a foreign income. So my apartment costs roughly $350 Canadian is what it costs to rent it. But I say roughly because every month it would be a different exact amount in Canadian. So if in January I am paying 5,000 pesos, that will be $350 Canadian, let's say. Then February I'm paying 5,000 still, but that's only going to cost $340 Canadian because as inflation rises, the peso falls, and I get more pesos to my Canadian dollar. So then in March, I'm still paying 5,000, but I'm only paying $330 Canadian. And then in April, I'm paying 5,000, which is $320 Canadian, $310 Canadian. And then all of a sudden, 6 months is up, and I no longer pay 5,000, I pay 6,000. So all of a sudden, then I'm paying $350 again. Then I'm paying $340, $330. Does that make sense? So I am actually extremely sheltered from the inflation because I go to the store and, milk and sugar, they've gone up again. But then as I change money, or withdraw money from the machine, I get more pesos to my Canadian dollar. But the local people are not sheltered from that. So it's actually very hard to work with people that you are not affected by it, but they are. So it's very complicated. Argentina had their primary elections the second weekend of August, so just 2 months ago. And the primary elections in Argentina are not like the American primaries. It's kind of like a filtering system. Anyone who wants to can run for president, and then you have to have a certain percentage of the vote to then be on the actual ballot come October, which will be in 8 days is the election, on the 27th of October, on Sunday the 27th. And so they had the primary elections,
and there's kind of the current party could remain in power, or the opposite party is kind of, there are more parties, but really there's only two actual kind of significant, powerful parties. And the opposite party was favored to win by a much higher margin than expected. And so that happened on a Sunday, and the next morning, Monday morning, the markets awoke and the peso had dropped 30% overnight because the markets didn't like the forecast for the election. So we will see what happens in 8 days. I would ask you to be praying for that.
Do you want to say more about that, how you heard the audible voice of the Lord? What were you doing? Were you praying? Were you reading the Bible? Did you ever get that again? Or?
Yeah, none of the above. I was
So that's interesting. I wish I could go back in time and remember it better. I remember I was sitting in my church. Our sanctuary has a balcony. I was in the balcony. It was a regular Sunday service. It was not a mission Sunday per se. We were just singing regular songs, nothing to do with missions. And I just heard this voice, in like an out loud voice, that said, "Laura, you have to go on a missions trip." And I kind of just froze, and I didn't know what to do. And I do remember that I kind of decided to bargain with God, because I was in my second last year at university, and I said, "God, I have a better plan. Why don't I graduate from university, get a good job, and I can donate all kinds of money to missions? That's a better idea." I remember that I kind of posed that proposal, and all I got back was silence. Like, he didn't have to repeat himself, because he knew that I knew that it had been him. And so the service carried on, and we had the sermon, and it finished, and I just kind of sat there, and everyone got up and filed out, and I stayed sitting there. And a woman who was mentoring me at the time, discipling me, saw me there, and she came over and sat down next to me, and I just started crying, and she just sat there, and I said, I think God wants me to go on a missions trip. She's like, "Okay, cool, yeah." I'm like, I don't think you understand what I'm saying. God spoke to me. And I can't explain it. I think if I were you, I would think that I'm crazy, probably. It's never happened to me since, and that was in 2002. That was a long time ago.
That they have the same.
Oh, good question.
I've never asked that question per se, but most of my missionary friends have a much more organic call, I guess. And I mean, I often say that I never got like a missionary call. I got that word to do a missions trip. But I really believe that if I had thought at that time that saying yes to going for 2 months would have meant saying yes for my life, I never would have gone. No way. See? Cry every day? Okay, yeah. You know, it was just so not what I thought I wanted. But talking to the youth last night, it's just, God knows us better than we know ourselves. So he just said, this is, if it hadn't been for that, I never would have taken the next step. And then that's what opened up the door. And then, I'm so convinced that what I'm doing, I'm doing what I was created to do. Absolutely. So, yeah. Any more complaints? Or I'll probably cry tomorrow too, so don't be alarmed. Yeah. Well, thank you for listening. I think we have dessert coming up. So, thank you for listening.